Before Beverly and I left Canada, I never stopped to think about the food sitting in our refrigerator. I just bought it. The same things, in the same amounts, from the same stores, on the same schedule, every 2 weeks without fail. Costco on a Saturday morning. That was the rhythm of our lives in Hamilton. A trolley stacked with frozen chicken breasts, blocks of cheddar, 3-kilogram containers of yogurt, granola bars by the box, bagged salad mixes that would go soft at the edges by Thursday but still technically counted as fresh. We had a chest freezer in the garage, same as half the neighborhood. I filled it the way my parents filled theirs, and their parents before them. It just felt like what you did. I never asked myself why so much of what we ate had to last that long. I never asked why the bread we bought could sit in a cabinet for 2 full weeks without changing. I never asked why the chicken breasts, vacuum-sealed and frozen solid, had the texture of something that had been engineered more than raised. I never asked why the salad dressing had 16 ingredients when I could count what actually goes into a proper vinaigrette on one hand. I grew up in southern Ontario, and so did Beverly, and this was just how food worked in Canada. You stocked up, you planned ahead, you got the Costco membership, and you used it every Saturday because the alternative, going to Loblaws twice a week and paying $4 for a single red pepper, felt like a kind of insult. That was life, and I never saw anything strange about it. Then we moved. Beverly and I had talked about it for years before we actually did it. After I retired from 31 years in municipal planning, and after our son Marcus finally stopped worrying out loud every time we brought it up over Sunday dinner, we packed what mattered into 2 checked bags each, sold the house in the spring, and flew to the Philippines. Not Manila. Not a resort town, the province, barangay roads, roosters at 4 in the morning, neighbors who knew our names before we'd learned theirs. Countryside, the way the channel name says. The first thing that disoriented me about food here was how fast it disappeared. Not disappeared as in eaten, disappeared as in gone, turned, mold, softness, smell. Bread from the small local bakery was stale by day 2 and growing something by day 3. Vegetables from the Palenque, the wet market about a 15-minute tricycle ride from the house, wilted in the tropical heat within 2 days if I didn't use them. Meat had to be bought the morning I planned to cook it. There was no buying ahead. There was no stocking the chest freezer, because we didn't have a chest freezer. We had a small fridge, barely bigger than what I'd kept in my university dorm room back in 1983. I'll be honest. It frustrated me in the beginning, more than I'd like to admit. I had built my entire relationship with food around the idea that good planning meant buying in bulk, that a full freezer meant security, that fresh food was something you managed on weekends when you had time, and that the rest of the week you survived on what was already in the house. That was the system I knew. Standing in front of a Palenque stall at 7 in the morning, trying to figure out how many bananas we'd actually eat, before they turned, felt like being handed a new set of rules I hadn't studied for. Beverly adapted faster than I did. She started talking to the vendors while I was still trying to figure out which bunch of kangkong to buy. Within a few weeks, she knew which woman sold the best tomatoes, which man got his fish straight from the boats in the morning, and when to arrive before the best things were gone. She started cooking dishes I'd never tried making myself: sinigang, pinakbet, adobo from scratch with actual vinegar and real pork and garlic. Real garlic, not the pre-minced stuff in a jar from the bulk section. And somewhere in those first few months, I started noticing something I couldn't quite name. The food felt different. Not dramatically, not in a way I could photograph or put into a spreadsheet, just different, more present. A tomato from the Palenque actually tasted like something, not just like red and wet. A mango left on the counter to ripen properly, not the refrigerated kind shipped halfway across the world while still hard and green, was so sweet it almost seemed like a different fruit entirely from what I'd eaten my whole life. Rice cooked in the morning from a bag of local grain, still warm when we sat down at noon, had a texture and smell that the Uncle Ben's I'd been microwaving for 30 years had never once come close to. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't since I was a child. And that's when I began thinking backward. About Canada. About what I'd been eating for decades without ever really tasting it. About the full-chest freezer in the garage as though it were an achievement rather than a symptom of something I'd never bothered to examine. The first time I went back to visit Marcus and his family in Hamilton, I walked into a grocery store and felt something I hadn't expected. Not nostalgia. Something closer to unease. I stood in the bread aisle for a long moment. There must have been 40 different types of bread on those shelves. Whole grain, multigrain, high fiber, low sodium, fortified with this and enriched with that, some with ingredient lists that ran 30 words long. I picked up a loaf that advertised itself as hearth-baked artisan style and read the back label. 17 ingredients. 7 of them were things I would have needed to look up. And the best before date was 3 weeks away. I set it back on the shelf and stood there longer than I should have. Beverly found me still in the bread aisle a few minutes later and raised an eyebrow. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling, so I just said quietly, "That bread back home molds by day 3. Real bread does that." She looked at the label, then back at me, and nodded slowly. We bought nothing from that aisle. The rest of that visit felt like navigating something I'd spent my entire life inside without ever once noticing the walls. Grocery stores that felt enormous. Every square foot of space engineered to move product. Packaging so bright and aggressive it was almost loud. Snacks designed, and I mean designed, there is no softer word for it, to be impossible to stop eating once started. Things marketed as healthy, organic, natural, high protein, low-carb probiotic, that upon closer inspection were still just highly processed food dressed up in better graphics. I had spent decades buying all of it. I had never once thought to ask why the cracker box kept getting slightly smaller every year, while the price on the shelf kept climbing. I had accepted everything as simply the way food worked. And I understand why. I want to be clear about that, because this is not a story about sitting in judgment of Canadians for eating badly. It is not that simple. I am 64 years old, and I know that simple explanations for complicated problems are almost always wrong. I had a career, a mortgage. Marcus in minor hockey 3 nights a week during winter. Beverly worked until Marcus was in high school. We had long commutes and short evenings, and the kind of tiredness that does not come from doing too much, but from doing the same hard things for too long without enough rest. When you live like that, frozen chicken and 30-minute casseroles are not laziness. They are survival. The food system in Canada grew up around exactly that kind of life. Around families that could not spend an hour cooking dinner on a Tuesday. Around supply chains that had to cross 4 time zones to get a strawberry from California to a grocery store in Sudbury in February. Around the economic logic of shelf life and scale, and the enormous machinery of agricultural production that runs the same whether you notice it or not. The system was built that way. People just lived inside it. I had lived inside it for more than 60 years without once stepping far enough outside to see its shape clearly. I had a friend back in Hamilton, Dennis, who used to joke that he ate healthy because he bought the expensive version of everything at a Whole Foods. He had a drawer full of supplements and a meal prep routine he'd read about in a magazine. He spent close to $1,000 a month on groceries for himself and his wife, and he still felt tired all the time and couldn't figure out why. I'm not saying food was the whole answer for him. I don't know his whole story. But I think about Dennis sometimes when I'm at the Palenque at 7 in the morning, paying the equivalent of maybe $2 for enough vegetables to last 3 full days, and feeling genuinely better at 64 than I felt at 52. Here in the province, I walk to get food. Not always. Sometimes a tricycle. Sometimes Beverly drives us to the larger market in town. But often enough that it has changed the texture of my days in ways I'm still understanding. The palenque in the morning is alive. Vendors calling out produce arranged in bursts of color, the smell of fish and garlic, and something frying 2 stalls over. I buy what I need for the day. Sometimes 2 days. I carry it home in a mesh bag Beverly picked up for practically nothing from a stall near the market entrance. We cook what we bought. We eat what we cook. That is the whole system. Buy, cook, eat. It sounds almost embarrassingly obvious when I say it that way. But I spent most of my adult life in a food structure built around inserting as many steps between those 3 things as possible: processing, packaging, storing, shipping, preserving, marketing, until the food arrived on my plate having passed through so many hands and so much machinery that the connection between earth and table had been very nearly erased. You didn't eat food, you consumed products. And the difference between those 2 things is something I couldn't have explained clearly until I stopped doing one and started doing the other. I want to be fair here because fairness matters to me. The Philippines is not a food paradise. That framing would be absurd, and I would know it is absurd because I live here. There is junk food everywhere in this country. Fast food chains on every commercial street in any city of size. Sugary drinks and bagged snacks and things that have no business existing in a country with fresh mangoes and bangus and 100 kinds of local vegetables. The pressures of convenience and cost that reshaped the Canadian food system across my lifetime are reshaping things here too, just more slowly in more places, with more of the real things still existing alongside it. I have seen younger families in this barangay whose children grew up on instant noodles and now resist anything that takes longer to prepare. It is not a problem unique to wealthy countries. It follows the money and the pace of modern life wherever those things go. But what I can say honestly is this: the relationship with food still feels different here in enough moments and enough places that living here changed something in how I think about what I put in my body. And more than that, it changed how I think about what I accepted without question for most of my life. The last few years before we left, the grocery bills had become genuinely alarming. The inflation hitting Canadian supermarkets, the shrinkflation, where the package stayed the same size, but the contents quietly shrank. The moment I picked up a block of cheddar at Loblaws and did the math in my head and realized I was paying more per kilogram than I'd once paid for decent beef. Beverly and I used to joke darkly about starting a vegetable garden in the backyard. We never did. We just kept buying the same things at the new prices. Because what else do? You adapt. You accept the new normal. The new normal becomes the only normal you can see. Here, I paid the equivalent of about $3 for a kilogram of fresh tomatoes last week. Not mass-produced greenhouse tomatoes selected for their ability to survive shipping. Tomatoes that were growing 2 days before I bought them. I don't have a policy solution for what that comparison means. I'm a retired municipal planner in a rural province, not an economist. But I do think about that $3 kilogram sometimes when I read about record numbers of Canadians lining up at food banks. Something went badly wrong somewhere in the logic of a system that turned food, the most fundamental thing a person needs, into something unaffordable in one of the wealthiest countries on earth. I don't know exactly where that wrong turn was taken or by whom. I only know what the food tastes like here and what it tasted like in Canada, and those 2 facts have stopped feeling unrelated to me the way they once did. One thing nobody warned me about before we moved, and maybe nobody could have, because it requires living through it, is how much your sense of food changes when the food itself has a shorter life. In Canada, I bought things that could afford to wait for me. Apples that would still be edible 10 days later if I forgot about them. Bread that sat unbothered on the counter for 2 weeks. Canadian food is patient in a way that food here is not. And I think that patience slowly trained me over decades to stop paying attention. When you know the food will wait, you stop thinking about it. It becomes ambient, background, infrastructure. When the tomatoes will go soft by tomorrow if you don't use them, you use them. When the fish bought this morning needs to be cooked tonight, you cook it tonight. There is a directness to it that I found irritating at first and now find almost clarifying. The food tells you what to do with it. You are not managing inventory. You are responding to something alive. Beverly says I have become a better cook since we moved, and she is right, though not because I developed any great talent. I became more attentive, and attention, I have come to think, is the beginning of most things worth doing. There is a retired school teacher who lives 2 streets over. She grows sweet potato leaves in the front yard and cooks with them several times a week. She gave Beverly a handful once with zero ceremony, the way you'd pass someone a pen. In Canada, I cannot remember a single neighbor ever giving us food they'd grown with their own hands. Not because Canadians aren't generous, they are, but because somewhere in the logic of the food system I grew up inside, food became something you bought from a company and not something that moved between people over a low fence on an ordinary morning. I have had more real conversations about food in 2 years here, about what it actually is, where it came from, how to prepare it properly, than I had in the 40 years before in Canada. That is not an exaggeration. I genuinely cannot recall the last substantive conversation I had about food in Hamilton that wasn't about a restaurant someone had tried, a recipe from a television show, or whether the new grocery store on the edge of town had better parking than the old one. The Canada I came from had made convenience the highest value in its relationship with food, and I understand the reasons for that. I lived those reasons. Long winters, enormous distances, long work weeks, a food geography that means truly fresh produce in January is either trucked from somewhere warmer or grown in a controlled greenhouse environment, both options carrying costs in price and in something harder to name but real nonetheless. When your winter lasts 5 months and the farmer's market closes in October, your relationship with fresh food has a natural ceiling built by geography and climate. I am not pretending that living in Hamilton gave me the option of a year-round open-air market. It did not. But I think what being here gave me, more than cheap mangoes and tomatoes that actually taste like tomatoes, was the experience of living at a different pace. A pace at which food had not yet become entirely abstract. A pace that required me to think, almost daily, about what I was eating and where it came from. Not because I was making some principled lifestyle choice, but simply because the system here required it of me without giving me the option to opt out. The food system in Canada was extraordinarily good at removing that requirement. That was its design brief effectively. Remove the friction. Remove the inconvenience. Remove the daily cognitive load of thinking about food so that you could think about everything else that modern life demanded. The job, the commute, the mortgage, the kids, the hockey schedules, the renovation you kept putting off. The companies that built the food supply over the course of my lifetime got very good at this. So good that you eventually stopped noticing the food at all. You only noticed the packaging, the price, the brand name. You shopped on autopilot. I shopped on autopilot for decades. When I visited Marcus last spring, I was better prepared for the grocery store. I walked the aisles with more composure. I bought what my daughter-in-law needed for the Sunday dinner she was making. I looked, without the sharp disorientation of the first trip, at the shelf of bread with its 3-week expiry date. I clocked the protein bar aisle, about 15 feet long, every product advertising itself as clean, smart, high-performance nutrition. I noticed the cart beside me at the checkout, loaded almost entirely with things in sealed packaging, barely an ingredient visible if you took anything out of its wrapper. I did not feel superior to the person pushing that cart. What I felt was something closer to recognition. That was me for most of 60 years. There was nothing wrong with that person. There was nothing wrong with me for all those years of Costco runs and frozen chicken breasts and snacks that sat in the cabinet for 4 months. We were living inside the system we had been handed and calling it normal, the way everyone does with the system they grow up in. because there is no natural vantage point from inside it. The strangest part of leaving Canada, I have decided, was not the adjusting to something new. That part was hard but not surprising in its difficulty. The strangest part was coming back and seeing how much I had failed to notice while I was there. Food was one of the first things I noticed clearly, and in some ways the most intimate, because it is the thing you put inside your body 3 times a day, every day you are alive. It is not abstract. It lands in your stomach and your blood and your cells. And I had been, for most of my adult life, choosing what to put there based on what was cheapest, most convenient, most preserved, most efficiently packaged for a life that moved too fast for me to stop and actually pay attention to any of it. I pay attention now. That is the whole of it, really. I wake up and think about what we will eat. I walk to the market or ask our neighbor with the vegetable patch whether she has anything going this week. I cook things that would have gone off by tomorrow if I did not. I eat food that tastes like what it is. And some mornings, sitting on the porch with Beverly while the neighborhood starts its day, eating rice and whatever she fried with garlic from the palenque, watching the light come in low over the rooftops across the road. I try to remember what exactly I thought I was so busy with all those years in Hamilton that kept me from doing something as unremarkable as this. I cannot fully piece it together, but I suspect that was partly the point. When a system is designed to keep you moving too quickly to look closely at what you are eating, you do not look closely. You keep moving. You keep buying. You accept the extended expiry dates and the engineered flavors and the 40-foot cereal aisle as the natural order of things, because it is the only order you have ever been shown. And once you step far enough outside it to finally see the shape of the whole thing, really just see it as read an article about it or nod along at a documentary, it becomes genuinely difficult to step back inside and unsee it again.